You're at the Coaching Inn, 3D Coaching's virtual pub, where we enjoy conversations with people who are engaged in the world of coaching.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Coaching Inn. I'm Claire Pedrick, and today we have an open table in our pub, and we're here to talk about coaching and psychometrics. So if you remember, and there's a link in the show notes if you don't remember, McKee was on a few months ago and we had a great conversation about the use of psychometrics in coaching, and it has been the number 2 downloaded podcast of 2023. Well done, William. Whether or not you can ever surpass Catherine Mannix is a really interesting question, but maybe you can. So, William, hello. And
hello.
Hello to all our guests. We are going to get you to introduce yourselves in a minute, but William, give us a bit of a who are you and a bit of a summary of what you think about psychometrics in coaching.
A very quick summary. Thank you, Claire. Okay, so my name's William. I'm a business psychologist and executive coach. Once upon a time, I was a civil engineer, but I got more interested in people than tarmac and whatnot. I think maybe the school's career advice people could have been a bit more on it whenever they were talking to me. But anyway, we are where we are. It was a bit of a switch, but I'm glad I made it. So one of the things about making that switch from engineering into people was getting interested in some of the sort of sacred cows and ideas and things like that. And one of the ones that I did a bit of exploring around was psychometrics, personality testing and research. And I just found it quite interesting that some of the very, very popular tools were not particularly well supported by evidence. And I guess over the last couple of years, I have just raised that in a few different places and made a bit of a nuisance of myself. So that would be my short introduction.
Thank you, William. So let's find out who's come to the pub today. And I'm really interested in what has made you interested in this conversation. So Jamie, Adam, hello.
Good morning. It's good to be here.
So what piqued your interest?
Ooh, now that's a good question. For me, it's this quest for truth that we all embark on, I think, within the coaching sphere. I don't want to say industry, that sounds a bit mechanical, but that's for another conversation. A lot of truth gets assigned to psychometric testing, profiling, what have you, and it automatically leads people down a particular path. And is that with good reason? What value is there in that? Can we trust these things? Do people accept things wholeheartedly without understanding the full nature of it? So it was I'm here to kind of explore that a little bit further with the good people who I'm with here today.
Fantastic. And William put his thinking face on. So that's good. Jon Barton, hello.
Hi, Claire. Hi, everyone. We've been coaching for several years. I'm still in a corporate role, so I do coaching in addition to my kind of day job, if you like. I've been on the receiving end of psychometrics a few times, so for job interviews in the past, and also as a coachee. So I've been coached and had psychometrics introduced to me that way, and I found them very interesting. And as I've developed as a coach, I've found the tools, particularly interesting as I've been able to get a deeper knowledge of how they work. But I think as a coach, I've also become aware of some of the potential pitfalls as well, and the kind of allure, if you like, that these tools can have. And so I think that the thing that brings me here, I think, is to reflect a bit more about whether we're sometimes using the tools to satisfy our own needs as coaches, and we need to remember to keep the client at the center of it, particularly if we've only got superficial knowledge of a particular tool.
I'm really struck by that word allure, because it's that shiny thing that's attracting people. I love how I'm sitting here watching the conversation, watching William go, oh, Liz, hello.
Hi, Claire. Hi, everyone. I work in the NHS part-time and also have my own coaching business part-time, but I have the joy of being able to coach in both places. And I've put my hand up to come along today, really, I suppose, to challenge myself in a conversation that's going to be much more rigorous than perhaps I'm used to. I'm a fan of a particular type of psychometric, and I often use the theory of that within conversations as an invitation, as another way to think about things. And it's a Jungian-based tool, and it is the way I see the world. It's so ingrained in the way I see people and try to understand what's going on for them, to think about how best I can work with them. What are their preferences, things like that. So, but I'm conscious that I might be in a room full of people who think very differently to that. So, open to being nudged around a bit, I suppose.
What a wonderful thing is difference. Because it helps us make our own meaning, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Richard Bennett. I'm going in alphabetical order, you may have noticed. Richard Bennett, welcome.
So, my name's Richard. I run a business that provides executive search, team, board, systemic coaching services, and I'm also a psychometric practitioner. I'm here today because William is always my go-to. I love his healthy obsession with reliability and validity of various tools when I go around with my curiosity wanting to collect a new one. So he probably has stopped me over the last five odd years of investing money to learn something that might not be reliable and might not be valid. And he really is my guiding light on sticking with tools which are true and real. And the reason I'm here today, Claire, is when I listened to the podcast and conversation that you had with William, a line that you said around, from the coachee's perspective, you know a little bit more about me than I know about you. And I thought, that's true. And that sort of sparked a bit of a nerve, really. So I thought, and I've changed my style actually since then. But I thought it'd be great to turn up and join the conversation.
Well, it's lovely to meet you, Richard. It's funny, isn't it? Because what you've done there is you've given a really good example of how a line, which is what we're doing here, can cause us to think about stuff and make things different. Somebody said something to me on Friday about something else altogether, and I've sat with it all weekend, and it's sort of arrived yesterday. Okay, now I understand. So, Richard Procter, hello.
Hello, good to be here. I've been wondering, as you've been talking, whether I could describe myself as a recovering psychometric junkie. So prior to training as a coach and getting involved in coaching, I did a lot of facilitation for management teams and leadership teams in businesses, and leadership training, and have probably used, it's probably an exaggeration to say virtually every psychometric tool on the market in one guise or another. And I had a principle of always doing it on myself before I subjected it on clients, even if I was beginning a contractor to do it, so that I could understand it. So I always enjoyed that, but did begin to question. And I think I moved during that time from, probably 10, 12 years ago, the thing about pulling out that rabbit from the hat, saying, and this is you, through to saying, this is some interesting information, isn't it? What do you think? Because I think Claire often uses the term about making meaning and who's making the meaning. And I think in my early days, I was definitely using the psychometric to make meaning on behalf of the client, whereas I've learned that it's much more important that people make their own meaning. So I'm interested to learn about that. I do less of that now. I still do coaching, but I'm still interested. I still carry around my personal Strengths Finders profile as a kind of template that really describes who I am. So I kind of like that because it feels true to me, for me. And I'm in the middle stage. Somebody else who I'm doing some work for has asked me to do a psychometric profile. So I filled it in and not yet had the feedback. So it's an interesting stage at which to have this conversation.
What an amazing plethora of insights and questions and experience and wondering that we have around the table. I feel we represent an awful lot of things that are going on in leadership generally and in humanity. William, as you hear all those lovely things, what are you noticing?
I'm feeling quite nervous. There's a lot of really interesting perspectives in the room, and I want to tread lightly. So I guess just something that I'm noticing that is a little bit on my radar just now is this idea of making. Let's just go straight in, shall we? So this idea of meaning making, I think, is a really important one. And one of the things I've been wrestling with recently, I've got a whole bunch of half-written blog articles about this, and I never quite finished one to hit publish. But one of the places that some of these tools go to, and I'm thinking about a couple of tools in particular that the evidence base for in terms of published research is pretty poor. And I'm not saying that published research is the benchmark for everything either, but the benchmark for that is pretty poor, but the marketing is very aggressive. So you've got this kind of disconnect. And where that marketing tends to, if I was going to be a wee bit cheeky, hide, is in this idea of self-awareness. That actually the purpose of the tool is to help build self-awareness. And you don't really have to have a discussion about objective accuracy if we're just saying, well, okay, my friend, it's all about self-awareness and meaning making. And what I would say as well, how do we know that we're doing self-awareness rather than self-delusion? Because something can appear meaningful subjectively to the individual, but it's it's not accurate. And so one of the things I'd like to introduce as an idea is this idea of something that is neutral in terms of a worldview. So something like those ink blots, the Rorschach ink blots, or somebody showed me a pack of cards the other week. I think they're called Saga cards or something like that, and they've got very Freudian images on them. So it'll be like, an old haggard man, but he's wearing a beautiful robe. That was the one that caught me. They're not putting forward a worldview. They're just saying, here's an image, make of it what you will. So I'm not against this idea of subjective meaning making at all. Sometimes people say that to me, everything doesn't have to be published in a peer-reviewed journal, and I'm like, yeah, true. But those things aren't putting forward a worldview. They're just saying, here we are, make of us what you will. When it comes to some of these psychometrics that the evidence base is pretty poor for, they are putting forward something and saying, make of me what you will, but they're also putting forward a worldview saying, this is how people are. And it's this is how people are that I would challenge. I would say, well, what's the evidence for that? So they're not neutral the way that some of these more subjective tools might be. They're introducing a paradigm or a mindset or a view. And it's that view that I think, hang on a minute here, if I swallow that view and start to work from that view of how people are, how do I know that I'm not leading people into self-delusion rather than self-awareness? I guess is where I've gone.
So self-delusion or self-awareness, what are we thinking?
Silence.
Liz.
Mind is blown in the first 5 minutes. It feels like a really big question that one of those ones that's going to sit with me for a while as it trickles down, I think, and then back up into my brain. And I guess I'm immediately thinking about the conversations, even the ones that I've had this week, coaching conversations that I've had this week, and 360 feedbacks, actually. I think what has been my role already in that process towards self-delusion or self-awareness. Where am I culpable, I suppose, in questioning and playing with in my head.
Can I invite you to consider a different question?
Sure.
You said, where am I culpable?
Yeah.
I think my less guilty question is, what's my role?
Yeah, sure.
Richard Bennett.
I think if through unvalid and unreliable tools we are, as practitioners in it's quite an unregulated industry, leading people and encouraging people to be delusional about themselves, at best that's not fair, and at worst it's almost like against Trade Descriptions Act. It's inappropriate, I think. And I've watched people, even on LinkedIn, who are not super qualified, get super overexcited about tools and clients that they've got overexcited about tools that are unreliable and unvalid. And it just strikes me as a little bit of a con. And then what's even more worrying is when you challenge the practitioner, they're completely unaware of it. And that's probably even more worrying, that people are selling things that they don't know enough about.
I think there's something underneath what you're saying, Richard, as well, because there's something about ethical practice of the practitioner.
Word, Claire, I was struggling, as you saw. It's
as well as ethical practice of the thing.
Yeah.
And what I think I heard you say was when you take a lack of maturity in the ethical practice of the practitioner and a lack of maturity in the ethical practice of the tool, you get what you've just described. I was in conversation yesterday or the day before with a psychiatrist academic around the challenge in the coaching world, that it's unregulated, that people can set themselves up and they can do anything. And we're working with vulnerable people. And actually, it's the vulnerable people where this is most an ethical thing. Everybody wants to speak. Richard Procter.
I'm thinking about persuasion in the sense of that. I completely agree with the comments that have been made. Part of me is slightly a bit more relaxed, and I'm thinking if tools are used to ask questions rather than to give answers, is a slightly less harm being done than if we use it as a prescriptive thing. Not that I'm disagreeing with what Richard or William said. And the whole thing about persuasion is, yeah, I played a role. I have not been comfortable. I've played a role in the past where it's certainly used to kind of almost say, well, this is a really, I don't think I've ever said this is absolutely you, but that it carries a persuasive element, doesn't it? The glossy, the nice brand, all the rest of it is a sense of trying to persuade, which seems to be antithetical. That's not a pub word, is it? It seems to be going against what the spirit of and the philosophy and the ethics of coaching is about, which is not about persuading, but about discovery.
Yeah, Jon.
I like one of the terms you use, Claire, in simplifying coaching. You use the term power tools. I really like that because with a power tool, you need to know what you're doing. Otherwise, someone can get hurt. So they can be quite clunky and clumsy. The other thing I like about your metaphor of a power tool when using psychometrics is the imbalance of power. So, whether we can obviously discuss the different types of psychometrics and the extent to which they're kind of rigorously tested scientifically. But when you use a psychometric tool, how you introduce that into the coaching is really important, because it can just disrupt the otherwise very natural conversation you can have with a coachee. So I think the power tool metaphor is really helpful to help reflect on some of these ethical questions that we're covering.
That's so interesting, because recently one of my colleagues put on Facebook, "Can anyone lend me a chainsaw?" And I went, "Do you know how to use that?" And she went, "Yes, I do." And it was that visceral response of me that goes, "Oh, that's a very dangerous thing to do." Because of course it is, because if I used a chainsaw, that would be a very dangerous thing to do. But she's trained and experienced and knows what she's doing. So interesting. Jamie.
This has been a very interesting conversation so far, and it's gone deep very quickly. I'm struck by this thought of the tools that we use and the question that we kind of need to ask as coaches, perhaps, of is it a means or is it an end? And I think some of the marketing that gets wrapped around these things, it puts them more as an end in themselves rather than a tool for a greater end. The other side to that is what are we looking at that's useful and what are we looking at that's sacred? What we're dealing with, and I think, Claire, you mentioned about the vulnerability of some of the people that we deal with. And also in our approach, what we're doing is very, very quickly, and I'm sure everyone here has experienced this, within a few minutes of an initial conversation, people are opening up and sharing things that they haven't shared with friends and family. And you treat that's a sacred space. That's a sacred space. We're dealing with this beautiful, complex creature that we call people. And we tread that lightly. The second that we stop remembering that, it becomes an industrial exercise and a bit clunky. And we kind of lose our ethical right to continue in that conversation. And then everything else that gets added to that kind of disappears out the window because we've lost our mooring, so to speak. But keeping the question of what is it that's sacred, what is it that's good, allows us to then approach this question of how valid is a tool, knowing that there might be no perfect tool, but how good is good enough for the end that we're actually setting out for.
Interesting. Thank you. William, what are you thinking?
Oh, a couple of things, lots of things. So just on James' point there, I would separate for the interest of thought, I would separate the tool from the end. And that's quite it's like on one level, the most effective tool out there, however we choose to define effective, might be one that I would choose not to use for other reasons. And the reasons would be that it's subjectively very effective, but it's objectively not very accurate. And I think somebody told me something a wee while ago that apparently, you know how the ICF have like a complaints email address that people can send complaints in about coaches. And I only know this because someone told me. I don't know this from personal experience. I've yet to be complained about in spite of my best efforts. But apparently the biggest bucket of complaints that the ICF get is about coaches using psychometrics that they're not qualified to use. And I think that's really ironic, because really irony. You don't know, I'm sorry, I've been up all night with a toddler. I think it's really ironic because I would say actually it's not, even if you're qualified to use some of these ones, that's not good. I would say the biggest complaint should be coaches using tools that are not fit for purpose, not being unqualified to use them. But where I've ended up at is not so much looking at people. I've ended up looking at the vendors of these things. And the more I look at them, the more I get really angry. Actually, it's funny, somebody mentioned trading standards there. I have actually contacted and emailed trading standards about these things. Trading standards were very polite, but they said, actually, we've got quite a few other things to worry about, my friend. This isn't such a big deal. We've got a lot of counterfeit items. We've got this, that, and the other. We've got a lot of poisonous things on the market that people shouldn't be eating that they are. I said, well, okay, but these are potentially psychologically poisonous. But at the very least, I'd say very commercially aggressive and very cynical. So one of the vendors that I kind of nudge quite a lot has a big section on their site about having a science team. In the last 20 years, they've published one paper, and the paper was not good. I mean, you could almost argue that what they found in the paper invalidates the tool. So I think a lot of these vendors, and some of the vendors are very good. They publish a lot of research. They update their stuff. So I wouldn't lump all psychometrics into the same place, but some of these vendors are very, very commercially aggressive, and it is sort of buyer beware, caveat emptor. Another one that I was looking at the other day, they've started, I get more and more of their adverts on my LinkedIn feed because I made the mistake of engaging with one of their adverts, just asking a question. And, they're using the term become a coach. Do our 3-day qualification and become a coach. And they're starting to stitch that word in. And you can really see, if I'd never thought, if I'd never thought about it, why wouldn't I just sign up? Because it's a global brand. It's organizations talk about it. You wouldn't think for a second, hang on a minute here. If we changed some of the words about in the report, statistically, that wouldn't invalidate the report because the report's statistically invalid anyway. I can't think of. You would assume that if you go to buy a car from a car dealership, it's got an engine. As sleazy and greasy as car dealerships can be, that would be a pretty rational assumption. And yet, for some of these tools, the engine is completely absent.
There was such an interesting thing on the radio yesterday about driverless cars. And somebody who worked for a famous electric car company had left the company and is saying, they say that we can have driverless cars, but you need to know that it's not about the risk to the driver of the driverless car. It's a risk to the child walking down the road with a dog.
Yeah, how does it make the choice?
Which is exactly what we're talking about here, isn't it? So there's so much ethics woven into what we're saying today.
Yeah, it's a very underdeveloped ethical conversation in the coaching world. I think being a qualified practitioner doesn't satisfy the ethical criteria. I think there's a huge number of ethical questions it poses that are, would you use horoscopes? Would you use graphology? So graphology was the study of writing. And, if you did extra long Ys, or if your letters were forward leaning, there was a whole load of meaning made of that, which statistically turns out to predict nothing about anybody. And so, coaches would really, really sort of, have a reaction to the idea of bringing those tools in. And it's like, well, why not those tools and these tools? Where's the line kind of thing?
But it's heavily connected, isn't it, for coaches to income generation? I'm getting some real noddy nods there. Liz, what are you thinking?
Yeah, my brain's going in two directions, which may not be helpful. But the first train of thought I was having as I was listening to people was around the ethics of the usually organisational psychologists who train us to be practitioners in these tools, and just how little time and even when there is time spent on trying to understand the statistical reasoning behind all of the tools, how poorly explained and communicated that bit is. So I'm curious about that, and I think, I've been through a 3-day training and a 1-day training, and very little time spent on those, to the point where I would have to go back to the back of the book and try and read what they say in order to try and explain it. I don't have a great memory to start with, but a lot of curiosity, I suppose, about those people who are training us to use these tools. But the other avenue, I suppose, I'm thinking about is, and this, human beings like to tell stories, they like to hear stories, they like to create stories, and these tools are creating stories, and we are helping to create stories by how we explain them, how we introduce them, and to go sort of back to that, is it self-awareness, is it self-delusion through those stories? How will we ever know? How will we ever know? But I agree wholeheartedly, this is all 100% about ethics, really.
What you're saying there is so interesting, because I'm sitting here thinking about my husband and myself. So for years, people have said to us, using words from psychometric tools, which we have also done, that he's an introvert and I'm an extrovert. And that's not true, because actually what we have discovered in the last 3 years is that I gain my energy from being entirely alone, and he has to have people in order to be able to function. So those labels have not really served us, because I'm the outgoing one, he's the quiet one. That's true, but those are different kind of words, aren't they? But I've had to seek more and more to go off on my own into personal space because actually that's what's like life-giving for me, because being the life and soul of the party is not. And then if he's on his own, he can't function. So, it's a really interesting thing. Jon?
I listening to this. I think one of the important things, if we we're going to have to occasionally, we may find we have to use questionnaires in certain cases, and when working with corporates, and I think it's really important as coaches to say what we can and can't do, just to be very open and upfront about the extent to which we're an expert in something or not. The other thing I'm kind of taking away from this conversation is the importance of not putting a limit on our personalities. Personalities are they're not static, and so even a rigorous questionnaire will give you a picture. It may be based on self-reporting. I think explaining the limitations of questionnaires is really important, and keeping the emphasis on our ability to change. Carl Jung talks about the wilderness of human personality.
Yeah, thank you, Jon. Let's hear from Richard Procter, and we'll hear from you, Richard.
This is controversial. So are we saying, or William, are you saying, don't ever use these things? Or are you saying we need to be much more clever and aware and ethical in the way that we use them? So is there ever a good time to use psychometric tool?
Can I? So I think you have to split them into different buckets. I think you have to say there are not psychometric tools. There are ones that are validated strongly by peer-reviewed published research, and there are ones that are effectively made up and very well marketed. And I would almost say actually those ones don't deserve the label of a psychometric tool, but they own it and they wear it. They push themselves under that guise. So the conversation about how to use these things well is huge. And even if you have the most well-validated, statistically accurate one, you can still do quite a healthy amount of damage with that. So I think it's almost two separate conversations. What are the tools that it's ethical to use, and then what does ethical good use look like in practice? And you've got to be a wee bit careful about what conversation are we having just now. Not just that sounds terrible, but I've been in enough conversations where it jumps around and it's like, well, hang on a minute, are we talking about almost just the foundational element of if we were going to select these things on objective quality, what does that look like? Then it's a question of, okay, now you've got the good one, what on earth to do with it? Which power tool is actually plugged in, working and ready to go and safe? And then, okay, now how do you use a drill kind of thing? So I'm not saying never use is the short answer.
But power tool could be a sewing machine, or it could be a chainsaw.
Yeah, or an old scabby rusty thing that we found up the back of the garage with a fuse missing, and you think, don't know if I'd touch that. There's like anything, there's levels to it. There's hammers, and then there's hammers, and it's just okay, which one are we going for? Then the question of technique and what actually happens when you're debriefing these things and everything like that. I mean, that's a huge thing. But interestingly, or I think interestingly, to Liz's point, a lot of these companies that are pushing the ones that are not so great, in my view, they jump straight into the use. They don't jump into that foundation. They just go, right, okay, it's almost just assumed that this is of a quality. Let's not discuss what quality looks like or how we make decisions about quality in this domain. Let's just jump into someone's completed the profile. You've got the sheets and now you're putting it under their nose and this is what you talk about. Because I ask people, when I see people on LinkedIn that publish a wee thing saying I'm qualified, I'll occasionally just send a wee message or say, hey, I'm just really curious to understand when you did that course, how were subjects like reliability and validity discussed? How were you introduced to those concepts? I never get a good answer. It was like on day 2, they talked about face validity. It's like, okay, so how believable the thing is on its face, not how statistically accurate it is. Cool. Okay. And then the kind of ethical, the ethical alarm bell starts to go off a wee bit for me.
Mm. Richard Bennett.
Back to your point of what you and your husband were saying about the introvert extrovert. There is a tool on the market that does measure introversion and extroversion. And when they train you to use that tool, which has huge negative press about its lack of reliability and lack of validity, but when they train you to use it, they tell you that, but by the way, if your clients don't like the answer, they can change the answer because they own the profile. So if you were an introvert, Claire, and you're actually an extrovert, you've missed a trick, because they should have told you that you can change it and make it up as you go along. And if you're going to make it up as you go along, why go through the process in the first place?
Exactly. I'm just sitting here thinking, I'm thinking of doing a little check-in list for coaches to think about how they're doing in various areas. And it will be a little check-in list. It will not be a profiling tool or a psychometric test or anything else. It will be, here are some things to think about how well or not you think you're doing in each of these areas. But isn't it interesting how quickly one of those things can turn into something that sounds like something else? Because really all that is going to be is the back of an envelope. And that's its purpose. Its purpose is to be a conversation starter. Here's a back of an envelope. You know, how courageous do you think you are in your coaching conversations? Not, I am doing an assessment here. So, yeah, interesting. Richard Procter.
To lower the hand, I apologise.
William.
Just two things that are hopefully quite interesting. One of the things someone said was personality is not fixed. I think there's a really interesting discussion in there around what is personality and how literate on personality and personality psychology and personality research are coaches, because I think there's a fundamental thing about what's our mindset or what are our beliefs around people and how is that shaped by this. And there is some good thinking out there around this, and it depends how you define personality, but the idea would be personality traits are pretty persistent and pretty stable. The wonderful thing about humans is we can learn a whole bunch of behavior that sits around that, but the trait itself is pretty stable over time. So that's quite interesting. And again, like the kind of a lot of the time the vendors publishing these psychometrics take people off down a weird path when it comes to how do we even conceptualize personality. And then what does that, if we take on these beliefs around a particular model, how does that then start to show up in our coaching? And how does that start to box us in or guide us? Or do we, it's almost like this idea of like a kind of, what would you call it? Do you know about memetics? The idea of like an idea traveling through a population, the way that like a gene would travel through a population. And so it's like if I become infested with the idea that personality works a certain way, that I then start infesting other people. And one of the kind of tragedies of the really commercially aggressive nonsense vendors of these tools is that I think when I talk to people that have gone down those rabbit holes, they're generally speaking, they're not then a fresh slate to talk to about other ideas. You know, other ideas are then sort of a challenge to their existing thinking, which I think can be a bit of a, what am I trying to say? I just think it's a bit of a shame sometimes, because I think, well, if you hadn't met that company at that point in time and taken on this mimetic idea about personality, then there might be a bit more openness to exploring other ideas about it.
So open-mindedness really matters.
Yeah. And I say that as someone that's constantly trying to badger away at this myself, because I think actually I would love to drop the tools that I use in favour of better ones the minute they're published. I think it's, you know, I'm not the tools that I use. I'm just a guy that's picked up a few things and will drop them the minute better comes out.
Interesting. So, last orders. That's an English thing for those of you listening in other parts of the world. My question as we move towards the end is from everybody is, what do you know now that you didn't know when we started this conversation? And so that's one. And the other one is, what's the question that you're taking away to think about? I love that. Now there's thinking moment. Who's thought? Jon.
I found this fascinating conversation particularly we've had some really interesting conversations about the ethics of how the tools are kind of sold, and it's our duty as coaches really to challenge the rigor with which we're trained if we're going to be using these power tools. I think the question for me is to explore further the extent to which when we have conversations with coaching clients, the extent to which, if they're using these tools, that we're saying this is fixed versus fluid. I always see coaching as an opening up of possibility and encouraging an ability for the thinker to think about their opportunities and their potential to be the authentic person they were meant to be. And so I'm going to be reflecting on how the tools can get in the way of that sometimes, if we're told that personality doesn't change as much as it could otherwise do.
Thank you. Thank you. So some really interesting opening up questions for you. Liz.
Yeah, I'm really I'm sitting with that fluidity versus label space, I suppose. And I didn't study applied statistics. I did do sociology, amongst other things. And I do remember, sorry, a bit croaky. I do remember, a whole module around labels and how they're damaging and helpful, and where do we, that's a spectrum, and how do you navigate that? And I guess that I'm still sitting with that, but I definitely feel like I'm edged a bit further forward with that question and that thinking. And I have a very dear friend of mine who always challenges me about labels. So I feel like this is a topic for the next time we catch up. That will be a great place to explore this with.
Wonderful. Thank you. I wish I'd done sociology, but that's a different story. For those of you who don't know, I did a degree in applied statistics that has been of no validity to me in my entire life. Richard Procter.
Yes, in terms of what do I know I didn't know before, I think I'm kind of maybe rethinking, or certainly thinking much clearer about this question of not just the validity of the tool, but then the use of it. Not thinking because I've tried to use the sewing machine, it's okay to pick up the chainsaw or something like that. So just kind of sort of thinking about that more. And the question actually was, whereas it's not these days a regular part of what I do to use the tools, is thinking about if I do approach using one in the future, actually, how do I do that? That's the question. So, what is it I need to think about? Because there's lots here around the ethics and around the validity of the tool and about the way that it's used and who's doing it. And so there's lots of more questions. So the core question is, how do I do it the next time that I'm in that position to either offer one or have been asked to do one?
Great. Thank you, Richard. Jamie.
Well, I'm really grateful for the insights that come from the joys of a shared conversation.
Absolutely.
I've been really appreciative of that. I don't know about anybody else, but my mind will feast like a king on this for days. Probably like the kings of old more than modern ones. But anyway, that's a different topic. I'm struck particularly this morning by the ethical considerations of everything that we do. Williams referred to this more eloquently previously, but the need for a solid ethical foundation for everything, and the need for that cross everything that we do, however that actually works it out in our individual settings. I think that's absolutely crucial. Just reflecting back on William's experience with trading standards and psychological poison being administered. Interesting. That's one to feast on. But the question that I'm going to take away is how in practice I can approach a person's receptivity to any tool or exercise that I consider introducing, because the validity that they attach to it will be based upon their own understanding more so than on, the evidence or the marketing or whatever. It's all about how they take it. And if I treat that as really sacred and careful, then I will have to have done my work in preparation to even dare to suggest to bring in by invitation anything that I might be considering. And I think if I can dwell on that, I stand a cat in hell's chance of doing good for people and avoiding leading them up all kinds of dangerous garden paths to the back of garages where rusty old power tools might be laying around.
I'm just thinking about dancing with a chainsaw. Probably not a good idea. Roger Steer said, ethics is in everything. And I think for me, one of the things that this has really unpacked is the fact that the tools are an ethical thing and how we use them are a different ethical thing. So there's a huge amount of stuff here that maybe we'll have another conversation. Richard Bennett.
Yeah, I think when I came to this conversation this morning, I thought that when you use psychometrics in coaching conversations that you had to be super careful. I would say now that I know that you have to be super careful. So I will reflect on that as I move forward. And I think moving forward, as you know, we talk about being qualified and being an expert in these tools. I will still continue to only use reliable and valid tools. But what I will do is stop over preparing on the analysis with coachees on the debrief, continue to share all of the documentation, which is usually written in the King's Perfect English, so people can usually make their own, read the analysis themselves, and just really home in on those questions about what are your reflections on the information that you see, what resonates with you, what doesn't resonate with you. Is it true? Why is it true? Why isn't it true? And not over prep myself as the expert debriefer, because then I think subconsciously you can start to lead a conversation that you shouldn't be leading, and therefore give them the power tool and let them fire up the quattro.
Yeah, and they might say, this is really helpful, like it is a power tool, I need to cut down my tree. Or they might go, actually, it's a little twig and I think I can break it off my hand.
That's for them, isn't it? That's for them
absolutely.
to decide, and not us to say, we're going to get through this 2.5 hour debrief, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, and it's who leads, because when we lead, they follow. And when we lead heavily at the beginning of a relationship, they will follow us for a long time. And we may never get back into partnership. William, what do you know now that you didn't know at the beginning of this conversation?
Wow. I've just massively enjoyed the gentleness that's making me think about my approach to this whole thing, because I think sometimes I'll do the odd blog or things like that, and it's generally a wee bit more spiky. So I think there's something about the knowing that this can be explored in a very gentle and curious way with people that are deep into it. That I've been really fascinated by how the framing of this as an ethical discussion has really kind of come up in this conversation really, really strongly. And I think there's something in that for me, really something in that it's an area that's well worth exploring and developing and trying to contribute to, what are the ethical dimensions? Ethics isn't everything. So what does good ethical practice look like across these different levels of selection of tool, use of tool? Do we even use these things? So that's been really fascinating. And then a question would be, what would a useful contribution look like going forward? I've got a second question as well that's quite cheeky, which is, would Carl Jung, I was reading my Jung at the weekend, would Carl Jung actually use a Jungian psychometric? And I don't know if he would. So
I have a final question, which just came up for me, which is the one I'm going to take away, which is, is the ethics of using the tool in contradiction to the ethics of coaching? Are they in conflict? So that's one to take away, because that's the one I'm going to take away. Thank you all for coming to the Coaching In. William McKee, Jon Barton, Jamie Adam, Richard Procter, Liz Price, and Richard Bennett. What an absolute delight. People, listeners, let's have this conversation in the show notes. And I know that there'll also be a deeper conversation in the supervision community if you want to join us over there on Patreon. So thank you, everybody, for coming. Let's have a selfie as we go. Everybody smile. Marvellous. Thank you for listening, everybody. Thank you for coming, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care.
If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, we'd love you to share the podcast with a friend or leave a comment on social media. And if you'd like to become a regular at the Coaching In, you can subscribe on Podbean and all major podcast channels. We look forward to welcoming you next time. You've been listening to The Coaching In, 3D Coaching's virtual pub. For more information, check out 3dcoaching.com.